Thank you, Barbara. I think Pat can come and talk about satellite taggings if you want. Well, let's see if this is going to work now that Ari broke it. So let me put this up here. Okay, here we go. First, I would like to thank the conveners of this workshop for the opportunity to be here speaking to you about some fascinating work that my colleagues and I have been doing on satellite tagging. The work presented here is a result of the effort by many colleagues and funding organizations, and I would also like to thank them for the very long commitment to our projects. So for my presentation, I plan to speak a little bit about the long-range seasonal movements of large whales, present a brief history of methods to study whale migration, explain how satellite telemetry works and how tags are attached to whales, and present examples of the application of satellite telemetry methods for humpback whale research. Even though the humpbacks are used as a model in this presentation, the techniques that we're going to talk about here can be applicable to any large whale. And here's a model, a beautiful picture that my friend Tim Collins sent for the talk. So migration can be characterized as the seasonal movement of individuals between different habitats or geographic locations. Many whale species migrate from low-latitude wintering grounds where they mate, nurse their calves, or nurse their offsprings to high-latitude feeding grounds. The pattern that I'm showing here is typical of humpback, right whales, and possibly minke whales. Migration is not necessarily related to moving between breeding and feeding grounds, as some whale species will move between areas where food can be found on a seasonal basis. Understanding how whales move or migrate and how they use their habitat is important for a number of reasons. For example, determining migratory routes and destinations help us to evaluate where the critical habitats are and promotes more effective conservation efforts. In the context of the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, determining migratory routes and destinations is critical for the allocation of historical catches, which are currently one of the most important pieces of information going into the population assessment models. The first large-scale studies to understand migration were carried out with discovery marks during whaling operations. These marks, illustrated here, were stainless steel cylinders shot into the body of living animals Typically, the tag stayed embedded in the blubber or the muscle and was recovered when the animal was killed. Knowing the location of the mark's deployment and recovery allowed us to investigate migratory connections. And here's an example of what kind of information discovery marks would give us. The stars represent locations where whales were tagged or killed, and show migratory connections between wintering grounds in the Indian and Pacific Oceans to the feeding grounds in the higher latitudes. More recently, two main research techniques have been broadly used to gain insights into migratory destinations of whales: photo identification and genotyping. These methods are far more advantageous because they are non-lethal, so they allow for multiple resightings of individuals and long-term monitoring of populations. And here's an example of the importance of photo identification to determine migratory connections between feeding and breeding grounds. It was not until extensive photo identification studies were initiated that a strong connection between the whales feeding near the Antarctic Peninsula and the wintering grounds in the west coast of Central and Tropical America were found. Over the years, dozens of matches of whales between these two regions have been made. Photo identification has also been key in determining the wintering grounds of whales feeding in the Magellan Strait, and these whales also migrate to warm waters in the East and Central Pacific. Another example of the usefulness of photo identification studies is the discovery of some interesting long-range migratory connections, including whales from the Antarctic Peninsula going to American Samoa and Oceania, or crossing the equator towards wintering grounds off Costa Rica and Panama. Photo ID has also documented or demonstrated an inter-ocean connectivity, with a whale seen in Brazil and photographed in Madagascar 2 years later. And here are some of the migratory connections revealed by genotype matching. These are not only between wintering grounds in South Africa and Australia and their summering grounds in the Antarctic, but they also show a migration between low latitude migratory destinations. Discovery marks, photo ID, and genotyping are effort dependent. That is, data only comes from places where scientists are looking. In addition, they rarely provide detailed information about what routes the animals migrate through, about movements within breeding and feeding grounds, and how much time they spend in different habitats. These are some of the gaps filled by satellite telemetry. This has become a powerful method to study whale movements and migration, as they allow us to describe the exact path used by the animals and to determine how they use their habitat in a much more detailed fashion. So how does satellite telemetry work? In a very simplified manner, this is how things work. Here's our little whale with her tag attached to her back, and when she comes to the surface, a little sensor called a saltwater switch detects that the tag is outside of the water. That detection, the fact that it was detected it's out of the water, triggers a transmission to polar orbiting satellites. And the satellites store the information received by the tag and retransmit that to ground reception stations within the satellite field of view. The transmissions are processed and are sent to the researchers in various formats, in their offices most of the time. I think Christophe touched on this Argos system. Most cetacean satellite monitoring conducted to date, and I think most marine mammal satellite monitoring conducted to date, is based on the Argos system. This system calculates an approximate latitude and longitude of the whale from the transmissions received from the tags. Relative to other type of tags, such as radio tags or the suction cup tags that Ari just talked about, satellite transmitters can be considered a long term. Typical attachment duration in large whales is species-specific, but ranges from weeks to several months on average. These tags today commonly penetrate the body and anchor on the subdermal tissue. And here we have two examples of the most commonly used tags today. On the left, we have the limpet tag, which was developed to anchor in the dorsal fin of medium-sized cetaceans. And this is the tag that was put on the killer whales that Lisa showed on her talk, and then Christophe also showed on his. The electronic package of these tags remain outside of the body of the whale, and anchoring is provided by these two barb prongs. On the right here, we have a deep implantable tag, which is designed to penetrate the body of the whale and anchor at the interface between the blubber and muscle. For this type of tag, both the electronics and the attachment systems are embedded in the body. All the work that I'm going to present here is based on implantable tags. The use of the limpet tags on large whales is relatively recent. In terms of electronics, I think Christophe already talked about this, but the electronics that goes into the tags can provide location-only information or location plus environmental or behavioral data. The results that you're going to see shortly come from location-only tags. So large cetaceans can't be captured for instrumentation, and therefore remote methods are required for deployment of satellite transmitters. One method commonly used is fiberglass or carbon fiber poles. The tag is usually located at the front end of the pole and is pushed into the body when a small boat approaches. And here's a picture showing the moment the tag is implanted on the whale. A second method is a pneumatic gun or a modified line thrower, often referred to as the air rocket transmitter system, air rocket transmitting system, or ARTS. Here, the transmitter is attached to the end of a tag applicator or delivery rocket. The applicator slides into the barrel of the gun and is shot into the whale. Upon impact, the tag penetrates into the body of the whale, and the tag applicator detaches from the tag, falls into the water, and is later recovered. Now I want to show you the type of information satellite tagging can provide, and I'll start up with some migration studies. And my first example shows routes and destinations of humpback whales wintering off the coast of Brazil. I like to call this the 100-year question, because since this population began to be exploited in the early 20th century, scientists were interested in the migratory connections of these whales. It wasn't until satellite tags were deployed in these whales that their southbound migration through offshore waters far from the South American continent were described. Also, this study showed that these whales feed in offshore areas east of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. The tracks seen here represent 4 different years, and I wanted to highlight the following points. With only one exception, once these individuals departed from their breeding ground, they moved south in a nearly straight pattern. And a trip that was about 3,700 kilometers and took 40 to 60 days to be completed. For the most part, the migration routes were very consistent over time, with some tracks being almost identical in different years. And that shows, obviously, that these animals are repeatedly doing about the same thing. Most whales migrated through a relatively narrow corridor, and all individuals converged to the same general high-latitude feeding grounds near the South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. Now, to contrast with the South Atlantic data, I want to show you migratory routes and destinations of humpback whales wintering off the eastern coast of Australia. These individuals were tagged during their southbound migration near the southeast tip of the Australian continent. The tracks seen here represent only 1 year, and you can see much greater variability in the direction of the routes used towards the feeding grounds when compared to the South Atlantic data. Some individuals departed from Southeast Australia and moved directly to Antarctic waters. Others migrated towards the western coast of New Zealand, where they spent some time before they migrated south. You also see here the use of multiple migratory destinations near the Antarctic continent, and that shows in many aspects the contrast between 2 populations in the southern hemisphere. Satellite telemetry allowed us to discover humpback whale habitats not previously known in the South Pacific. These results come from the work of Claire Garrigue in New Caledonia, where tagging occurred in 3 different years. We see whales departing from the southeast corner of the main island and moving into many different directions. The whale tracks here are truncated to emphasize a unique feature of this population. Humpback whales wintering off New Caledonia seem to visit various habitats located near seamounts and smaller islands before they continue their migration to the feeding grounds. This unique aspect of this population was only found upon deployment of satellite transmitters. Many of the seamounts visited by these whales are remote and their utilization by humpback whales would probably not have been revealed if it wasn't for this technique. But I won't tell you everything about New Caledonia because Claire is presenting a poster tonight and she probably wants to tell you more about it. Satellite telemetry can also be useful to assess how whales use their habitat and how environmental variables can influence their movement and distribution. Here's an example using state space models to assess preferred feeding areas of West and South Atlantic humpback whales. Space state models use information on the speed and and direction of consecutive Argus locations to estimate the behavioral state of the animal. One of the possible states is defined as an area-restricted search, and that type of behavior has been shown to be associated with feeding marine mammals, or feeding behavior in marine mammals. And here's an output of the state space model applied to telemetry data. The little hollow black circles represent the model predicted locations, and the orange circles represent locations classified as ARS. Note that the majority of the ARS locations in high latitudes are located at or just south of the southern boundary of the Antarctic circumpolar current, which is an important habitat for the humpback prey, the Antarctic krill. Here's the same pattern. This is the same type of analysis for Eastern Australian humpbacks, showing the exact same pattern. Note the concentration of ARS behaviors just south of the Antarctic circumpolar current. Satellite telemetry is also useful to assess habitat. It's also useful to assess habitat use relative to anthropogenic activities. Such assessments can be done or can be used to propose conservation and management measures. As an example, I'll bring you to the west coast of Brazil, which is currently observing a boom in oil and gas exploration due to the recent discovery of important oil fields. What you see here are areas where oil production is occurring or planned. The production fields are represented by the yellow polygons, and the areas where oil production is planned, called the exploration blocks, are represented by the polygons outlined in orange. And here are the locations from migrating humpback whales departing from the Abrolhos Bank, which is the main breeding ground off the coast of Brazil. These whales have a coastal migration stream showing some important overlap with the exploration fields, and they also have an offshore migration, an offshore stream. This data showed that the negative impacts to the coastal stream could occur if certain exploration blocks are developed, and they provide scientific background to be used for conservation actions to protect important habitats potentially affected by anthropogenic activities. Satellite tagging has also given us the opportunity to look at navigation of humpback whales in an unprecedented way. The results from this study, these results from the study I'm showing you was conducted or obtained by Travis Horton. He demonstrated that migratory humpback whales can navigate with extreme precision for hundreds of kilometers, as shown here by these almost linear tracks. This is striking given these animals are subject to sea surface currents, weather events, and different magnetic fields. And this highlights the need to better understand navigational cues used by these whales. And speaking of navigational cues, Trevor has been working on a study where he tries to understand if whales can be using the moon to pace their migration. Here he's using data from whales tagged in Australia and Brazil, and I want you to focus on these two panels on the bottom. This figure illustrates the declination of the moon on the x-axis and the latitude on the y-axis. It shows that once whales start their migration, they will cross certain latitude marks at relatively constant pace, which seems to be correlated with the declination of the moon. For example, the declination of the moon was 0 as Australian and Brazilian humpback whales crossed 10-degree latitudinal intervals since they departed from the wintering grounds. This is a work in progress, but has the potential to put together pieces on the whale navigation puzzle. You've seen that satellite tagging has become a powerful non-lethal technique to study whale biology and to promote their conservation. This method not only complements, but sometimes provides more detailed information than other more traditional methods such as photo ID and genotyping. Telemetry technology is improving quickly, and I think Christophe mentioned that, and progresses in technological development should make satellite tagging more efficient and more accessible to those interested in large whale research in the Southern Oceans. With that, I want to finish, and thank you very much for listening.
computador. ¿Me ayudas?